Rain hammered against the tall windows of Harlan Tower like angry fists. It was well past midnight in the autumn of 1895, and Manhattan lay far below, a glittering, restless sea of gaslights and shadow. Inside the top-floor office, James Harlan sat alone at his massive oak desk, the only light coming from a single green banker's lamp. His fingers froze mid-turn of a page. The entire folder for the Brooklyn Bridge extension months of calculations, contracts, and structural plans had been completely erased. Every critical number, every signature, gone. Clean as if they had never existed. Only one thing remained. A small folded note placed exactly where the most important document should have been. In neat, feminine handwriting, it read, "Numbers do not lie." James stared at those 5 words until they blurred. His heart, usually steady as the steel he forged, gave one hard, uneasy beat. He rose slowly, the chair scraping loud in the empty room. For a long moment he stood there, tall and broad-shouldered in his perfectly tailored black coat, staring out at the rain-streaked city he practically owned. Who would dare? Who would walk into the most guarded building in New York, past 3 night watchmen and 2 locked doors, and do this? He pressed the brass button on his desk. Once, twice. Within minutes, the heavy door opened. Mr. Caldwell, his longtime butler, appeared already pale. "Summon Miss Harper James," said his voice low and controlled. "Now." Caldwell hesitated only a second. "Sir, it's nearly 1 in the morning. I don't care what time it is. Bring her." James turned back to the window, watching rain slide down the glass, like tears he had long forgotten how to shed. 3 weeks. That was how long Lily Harper had worked for him. In 3 short weeks, she had become the quietest and most unnervingly accurate secretary he had ever hired. She spoke only when spoken to. Her handwriting was flawless. Her memory for numbers was almost frightening. And she never smiled. Not once. Now, standing alone in the storm-lit office, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. Real curiosity. The kind that made his chest tighten. The door opened again. Lily Harper stepped inside, still wearing her simple dark gray dress from the day. Her coat was damp from the rain. A few strands of dark hair had escaped her neat bun and clung to her pale cheek. She looked small against the grand room, yet she carried herself with a straight-backed calm that somehow made the air feel heavier. She stopped 3 feet from his desk and met his eyes without flinching. "Mr. Harlan," she said softly. Her voice was quiet, steady, and completely unafraid. James studied her for a long moment. The green lamp cast soft shadows across her face. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost unfair. Delicate features, serious gray eyes, and a mouth that seemed permanently set in quiet resolve. He lifted the small note between 2 fingers. "Did you write this?" Lily's gaze flicked to the paper, then back to him. She didn't answer right away. A flicker of something fear-determination passed behind her eyes before disappearing again. "Yes," she said at last. "I did." The silence that followed was so complete, James could hear the rain drumming on the roof far above them. He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping. "You erased an entire project folder worth nearly $2 million. Without permission, without warning. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Lily's hands remained folded in front of her. Her knuckles were white. "I do," she whispered. "Then explain yourself." She drew in a slow breath, as though the air itself hurt. "Because those numbers were wrong, Mr. Harlan. Dangerously wrong. If the bridge extension had gone forward with those calculations, the center span would have failed under load within the first year." James felt the floor shift beneath him. He had built his empire on steel and absolute control. No one questioned his decisions. No one dared. Yet this quiet girl from the tenements of Brooklyn had walked into his tower and erased his future with a few strokes of a pen. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, his voice rougher now. Lily looked down for the first time. When she spoke again, her words were barely above a whisper. "Because no one ever listens. Until it's too late." Something in her tone, the quiet exhaustion, the old pain buried deep, made James pause. He saw it then, the way her shoulders carried an invisible weight, the way her eyes had learned to hide everything. He stepped around the desk closer to her. The scent of rain and faint lavender soap reached him. "Who are you, Miss Harper?" he asked, almost gently. "Really?" Lily lifted her gaze again. "Everything the numbers showed you." Lily hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly. For the first time that night, real fear flickered across her face, not of him, but of what might happen if she finally spoke. Yet after a long, trembling breath, she nodded, and in that rain-lashed tower high above a sleeping city, the most powerful man in New York and the quietest secretary in the building stood on the edge of something neither of them could yet name. A truth, a danger, and perhaps the beginning of being truly seen. The rain had not stopped. It continued to fall in heavy sheets against the windows of Harlan Tower, as if the sky itself refused to let the night end. James Harlan remained seated behind his desk, the small note still resting between his fingers. The green glow of the lamp cast long shadows across Lily Harper's face. She stood perfectly still, yet he could see the faint tremble in her clasped hands. "Sit down, Miss Harper," he said quietly. Lily hesitated. For a moment her eyes darted toward the door, as though weighing the distance to safety. Then slowly she lowered herself into the leather chair opposite him. The fabric of her damp dress made a soft sound against the seat. James leaned forward slightly. "Tell me why." Lily swallowed. Her throat moved visibly. She looked down at her hands for several long seconds before speaking, her voice barely louder than the rain. "Because the calculations were off by nearly 12% on the tension load of the main cables. If construction continued, the bridge would collapse under its own weight before the first train ever crossed it." James felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Hundreds of lives, thousands of workers, his own reputation. Everything balanced on numbers she claimed were wrong. He studied her carefully, the way her shoulders stayed rigid, the way her gray eyes refused to fully meet his for more than a moment. "How did you know?" he asked. "Those documents were locked in my private safe. You had no authority to open them." Lily's fingers tightened until her knuckles turned white. A shadow passed over her face, something old, something painful. She drew a slow, shaky breath. I grew up watching my father work in one of your steel mills. Not this one. The old Riverside plant. Before you bought the company." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. James went very still. "He was a structural engineer," she continued softly. "He found dangerous flaws in the support beams. He wrote reports. He begged the previous owners to stop production until the fixes were made." She paused. The memory seemed to pull her backward in time. They told him to mind his own business. 2 weeks later, a crane collapsed during night shift. My father was standing directly underneath it. Lily's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She had clearly learned long ago how to hold them back. "No one was ever held responsible," she whispered. "The company buried the real numbers. They called it an accident. My mother received a single month's wages and a letter saying how sorry they were." The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain outside. James felt something shift inside him, an unfamiliar discomfort. He had bought that mill years ago to expand his empire. He had never asked about the accidents that came before him. Why would he? Everyone told him the past was best left buried. But now this quiet woman sat across from him, carrying the weight of that past in every careful word. I taught myself accounting. Lily went on, her voice steadier now, though still soft. Every night after working 12-hour days as a seamstress, I studied mathematics from borrowed books. I learned how numbers could hide the truth or reveal it. She finally looked up at him, her gray eyes bright with quiet intensity. When I saw the same patterns in the Brooklyn Bridge documents, I couldn't stay silent again. Not this time. James leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt truly unsettled. No one had ever acted against his orders so boldly. Not his lawyers, not his partners. Not even Theo Grant, who had known him since they were boys. Yet this young woman from the crowded streets of Brooklyn had risked everything: her livelihood, her reputation, her future, simply because the numbers demanded it. He could see the fear in her now, the way her shoulders trembled slightly, the way she kept glancing at the door, as if expecting to be thrown out into the rain at any moment. She had so much to lose. He knew she had a sick mother. He had seen the medical bills that quietly appeared in her employment file. This job was the only thing keeping her mother alive. And still, she had chosen to act. James stood up slowly and walked to the window. The city lights blurred behind the rain. He spoke without turning around. Most people in your position would have looked the other way. They would have protected themselves. Lily's voice came soft from behind him. I've spent my whole life protecting myself by staying quiet, Mr. Harlan. It hasn't brought me or anyone else any safety. Something in her words struck him deeper than he expected. He turned to face her. The green lamp painted soft light across her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her eyes and the determined line of her jaw. James felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest, part anger at the system he had unknowingly inherited, part something warmer, more dangerous: admiration. He walked back to his desk and sat down again. You're not fired, Miss Harper. Lily's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, real surprise broke through her careful mask. James continued, his voice low but firm. Instead, I want you to do something for me. Tomorrow night, after the office closes, you will come with me to the old Riverside plant. Bring whatever tools you need. You are going to show me every single flaw you can find in those old records. He paused, letting the weight of his decision settle between them. And this time, you won't have to do it in silence. Lily stared at him for a long moment. Her lips parted slightly as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Fear and cautious hope warred behind her eyes. She finally gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, Mr. Harlan. As she rose to leave, James watched her move toward the door, small soaked and carrying far more than any 24-year-old should ever have to carry. The rain continued to fall. But inside the quiet office, something had already begun to shift. A crack in the wall of silence that had protected James Harlan for so many years. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted that wall to remain standing. Doi jai la, fan ba juak viet jung yu, go lien mach huan hao voi pan he, fan ba. Voices in the dark. The old Riverside steel plant smelled of rust and forgotten oil. It was past 10 at night when James Harlan's carriage stopped outside the iron gates in Brooklyn. The rain had finally eased into a cold drizzle, but the air still felt heavy. Flickering gas lamps cast long, uneasy shadows across the empty yard. Lily Harper stepped down from the carriage, clutching a worn leather satchel to her chest. She had changed into a simple dark wool dress, but her face looked even paler than it had the night before. James walked beside her in silence, his tall frame cutting through the mist. Mr. Caldwell had tried to protest, bringing her here so late. But James had waved him away. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure why he was doing something, only that he needed to. Inside the main office building, the air was colder. Dust covered the old desks. Stacks of yellowed ledgers lined the shelves like sleeping ghosts. Lily moved without hesitation to the largest filing cabinet. Her fingers worked quickly, pulling out thick folders with practiced ease. James watched her in the dim light of the oil lamp. "You've been here before," he said quietly. Lily paused, her hand resting on a heavy ledger. "Not inside this room," she answered softly. "But I used to wait for my father outside the gates. Every evening." She opened the first ledger and spread it across the table between them. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in near silence. Only the turning of pages and the scratch of Lily's pencil broke the quiet. James had expected resistance or nervousness from her. Instead, she moved through the numbers with frightening precision, circling errors, marking dangerous patterns he had never noticed. Every so often, she would point to a column of figures and speak in that same soft voice. Here. The weight tolerances were altered 3 times in 1 year. They knew the beams were weakening. James felt a slow burn growing in his chest. Then the door creaked open. Mr. Donovan stepped inside, his heavy boots loud on the wooden floor. The longtime plant manager was a broad, gray-haired man, with a face hardened by decades of factory work. "What is this?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing at Lily. "A woman in my records room." At this hour, James straightened. "Miss Harper is here under my direct orders, Donovan." The older man's face reddened. "With all due respect, sir, women bring nothing but trouble and distraction, especially one who thinks she can dig through numbers she doesn't understand." Lily kept her eyes on the ledger, but James saw her fingers tighten around the pencil until it nearly snapped. Before James could respond, another voice cut through the room, sharp and cultured. "I must agree with Mr. Donovan on this matter." Eleanor Langford swept in behind him, her expensive fur-trimmed coat still dry despite the drizzle. The wealthy widow and prominent charity chairwoman carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world should bend to her opinion. "James, darling." She continued, her tone laced with disapproval. "Using cheap labor is one thing, but allowing an unknown girl from the slums to access sensitive company documents, I hear rumors she has ulterior motives. Perhaps even sabotage." Lily remained perfectly still, but James could see the slight tremble in her shoulders. He felt something protective rise in him, unexpected and fierce. "Mrs. Langford," he said coolly, "Miss Harper stays. The decision is mine." Eleanor lifted an elegant eyebrow but said nothing more. She gave Lily one last measuring look before turning and leaving with Donovan, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. The room fell quiet again. James turned back to Lily. She was staring at the open ledger, but her eyes were distant. "Miss Harper." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her hand moved slowly across the page, tracing an old entry. "My father wrote this one," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet, James almost missed it. "He marked the flaw right here, in red ink." They erased his note later. "But I remember the night he came home and told my mother they wouldn't listen." A single tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She brushed it away quickly, angrily. James felt his throat tighten. He had never seen her like this, the careful mask slipping, revealing the depth of pain she carried in silence for so many years. Later that night, as they continued working, the tension in the old building grew thicker. Lily reached for a tall stack of boxes on a high shelf. She stretched upward on her toes. The stack shifted. James moved without thinking. Lily! He caught her just as the heavy boxes crashed down where she had been standing. His arms wrapped around her, instinctively pulling her against his chest. For one breathless moment they stood frozen in the dim lamplight, her face pressed to his coat, his heart hammering wildly against her ear. Lily's hands clutched his shirt. Her whole body trembled. "I'm sorry," she gasped, voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." But James didn't let go. Not right away. He felt the warmth of her tears soaking through his shirt. He felt the years of swallowed pain, the exhaustion, the lonely courage that had kept her going. In that moment behind the quiet secretary he had hired 3 weeks ago, James Harlan finally saw the real Lily Harper, the girl who had lost her father, the woman who taught herself everything in the dark, the soul that refused to let injustice win even when no one would listen. Gently he eased her back just enough to look at her face. "You're not alone in this anymore," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. Lily looked up at him, eyes shining with unshed tears, and something new, fragile, hesitant trust. From the doorway, unnoticed until now, Mrs. Clara Hayes James's elderly housekeeper, who had accompanied them, spoke softly. "Silence isn't weakness, Master James. Sometimes it's the sharpest weapon a person has. But even the strongest weapon needs someone willing to listen." James met the old woman's knowing eyes. Then he looked back at Lily, still held carefully in his arms. For the first time in his privileged life, he truly understood. The truth often hid in the numbers, and in the voices that had never been allowed to speak. The gas lamps in the old Riverside plant burned low that night. Lily Harper sat alone at the scarred wooden table, surrounded by open ledgers and faded receipts. The rest of the building was quiet, except for the distant creak of metal and the soft patter of rain on the tin roof. Her fingers moved steadily across the pages, but her heart was racing. She had found it. Payment records, secret deposits, dates that matched perfectly with the time safety violations had been overlooked. Mr. Donovan's signature appeared again and again, small, careful amounts funneled from a rival steel company. Enough money to silence reports, enough to let weak beams and faulty cranes stay in use. Enough to kill her father. Lily's hand trembled as she copied the final line into her private notebook. She did not cry. Not yet. Instead, she folded the evidence, carefully placing it between the pages of an old ledger where no one would think to look. She would finish the report first. She would make it undeniable. Only then would she bring it to James. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel outside made her freeze. Moments later, the heavy door swung open. Eleanor Langford entered, first her elegant coat sweeping the dusty floor. Mr. Donovan followed close behind his face, flushed with anger. "There she is," Eleanor said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Working alone in the middle of the night with company secrets. James, this girl is clearly a spy planted by your competitors." Lily rose slowly from her chair. Her gray eyes were calm on the surface, but inside years of swallowed rage were rising dangerously close to the surface. James stepped into the room behind them, his tall frame filling the doorway. His expression was unreadable. "Miss Harper has my permission to be here," he said evenly. "Permission?" Eleanor laughed coldly. You are letting a girl from the Brooklyn slums handle documents that could destroy your entire empire. I have spoken with several board members already. They agree she must be dismissed at once. For the good of the company. Mr. Donovan crossed his arms, his voice booming. I warned you, sir. Women like her only bring trouble. She's been digging through things she has no right to touch. Probably looking for something to sell. Lily's hands clenched at her sides. She looked at Donovan. Really looked at him, and the mask she had worn for so many years finally cracked. You. She said, her voice low but shaking with fury. You took their money. You changed the numbers. You knew the crane was unsafe the night my father died, and you did nothing. The room went deathly still. Donovan's face turned purple. How dare you accuse me, you little? You signed the receipts, Lily cut in, her voice rising for the first time. I have the dates. I have the amounts. You let men die so you could line your pockets. My father begged you to fix the beams. He begged you, tears burned in her eyes now. But she refused to let them fall. I was only 12 when they brought his body home. I watched my mother break apart. And all these years, you walked around pretending you were an honest man. Her voice cracked on the last word. James stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. He had never seen Lily like this, the quiet, controlled woman who barely spoke, suddenly burning with raw pain and courage. Every word she spoke carved deeper into him. He had bought this plant. He had trusted Donovan for years, and all this time, he had been blind. Eleanor Langford's face tightened with displeasure. James, you cannot possibly believe the word of this. This girl over a loyal employee. Think of your reputation. Think of what people will say. James looked at Lily. She was breathing hard, her shoulders trembling, but her eyes, those serious gray eyes, held his without flinching. In them he saw everything: the lonely nights studying by candlelight, the fear of losing her sick mother, the unbearable weight of silence she had carried alone for so long. He felt the choice settle heavily on his shoulders. Protect the empire he had built, or protect the truth, and the woman who had risked everything to show it to him. James stepped forward. Enough. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. He looked directly at Eleanor and Donovan. Miss Harper will not be dismissed. Not tonight. Not ever. Eleanor's eyes widened. James, I said enough. He turned to Donovan, his gaze ice cold. You are relieved of your duties immediately. Pack your things. My lawyers will be in contact tomorrow. Donovan sputtered, but James raised a hand, silencing him. As for the rest of it, I am ordering a full internal investigation. Every ledger, every payment, every accident report from the last 15 years will be examined, and Miss Harper will lead the review alongside me. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor Langford stared at him in disbelief before turning sharply on her heel and leaving without another word. Donovan followed, muttering curses under his breath. When the door closed, only the sound of rain remained. James turned to Lily. She was still standing in the same spot, chest rising and falling rapidly. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. For the first time since he had known her, her eyes were not guarded. They held something fragile and new, a tentative, trembling trust. James took one slow step closer. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, Lily, he said softly, using her first name without thinking. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. Why? Why are you doing this? James searched her face for a long moment. The green lamplight caught the tears on her lashes and the quiet strength that had survived so much pain. "Because I'm tired of only hearing what people think I want to hear," he answered. "And because you showed me what real courage looks like." Lily's lips parted slightly. The wall she had built so carefully over the years trembled, then cracked just a little more. In the dim, dusty office of the old steel plant, something irreversible had shifted between them. Not just justice, but the fragile beginning of belief in each other and in the possibility that silence could finally be broken. Snow fell softly over Manhattan that December night. It drifted past the tall windows of Harlan Tower like quiet whispers from the sky, blanketing the city in a gentle white hush. Inside the top-floor office, the green banker's lamp still glowed, casting a warm circle of light across the massive oak desk. James Harlan stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the snow swirl outside. The internal investigation had ended 3 weeks ago. Mr. Donovan was gone, dismissed without ceremony. The old ledgers had been corrected. Unsafe equipment had been replaced. Wages for the workers at the Riverside plant had been quietly increased, and a new fund had been established to support the families of those who had lost loved ones in the mills. Lily Harper had been named its director. She stood a few feet away from him now, near the window, her simple dark dress contrasting with the falling snow. In her hands, she held a small folder, the final report of the changes they had made together. "You did more than I ever expected," James said softly, breaking the gentle silence between them. Lily looked down at the folder, her fingers tracing its edge. "I only showed you what the numbers already said," she replied, her voice quiet as always. "You were the one who chose to listen." James turned to face her fully. In the weeks since that explosive night at the plant, something fundamental had shifted inside him. He no longer walked into meetings expecting everyone to agree. He had started asking harder questions, and for the first time in his life, he had begun to feel the weight of the silence he had once demanded from those around him. "I spent years surrounded by people who only told me what they thought I wanted to hear," he admitted, his voice low and rough with honesty. "They laughed at my jokes, even when they weren't funny. They nodded at every decision. I told myself it was respect. But it wasn't respect, Lily. It was fear or greed." He took a slow step closer. "You were the first person who dared to show me the truth, even when it cost you everything." Lily's gray eyes lifted to meet his. There was still a trace of old caution in them, but the wall she had built so carefully was no longer impenetrable. A soft vulnerability lingered there, now fragile, but real. She hesitated, then spoke. "I learned silence when I was very young. After my father died, I realized that speaking up only brought pain. So I stayed quiet. I watched. I studied the numbers because they never lied to me. They were the only safe place I had." Her voice trembled slightly. "But silence becomes heavy when you carry it alone for too long. It almost broke me. Until you chose to stand beside me instead of above me." The snow continued to fall outside, muffling the sounds of the city far below. A soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Clara Hayes entered quietly, carrying a silver tray with 2 cups of coffee. The elderly housekeeper set it down without a word. But before leaving, she gave James a small knowing nod, the same look she had given him that night at the plant. As the door closed again, Eleanor Langford's unexpected visit from earlier that week came back to James. She had returned to the tower, not as an adversary, but as someone changed. Lily had sat with her for hours, showing her the cold, undeniable evidence and sharing the quiet story of her father. Eleanor's polished exterior had cracked, By the end of that meeting, the powerful charity chairwoman had promised to carry the reforms to other factories across New York's elite circles. Change was spreading slowly but surely. James took the 2 steps that remained between them. "Lily," he said, using her first name with a gentleness he rarely allowed himself. "You are no longer just my secretary. I want you as my partner in every future project, in every decision that matters." Lily's breath caught. She looked up at him, searching his face with those serious gray eyes that had once hidden so much. For a long moment she said nothing, the snow falling steadily behind her, like a silent witness. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I accept, on one condition." James waited, his heart beating a little faster. "We build something different together," she said. "A system where the numbers are never allowed to hide the truth again. Where the quiet voices, the ones that have been ignored for too long, are finally heard." A small, genuine smile touched James's lips. It was rare, unguarded, and real. Together, he agreed quietly. Lily nodded. For the first time, she let herself smile back, just a little, just enough. They moved to stand side by side at the tall window. Below them, New York lay covered in fresh snow, the gas lights glowing softly through the white veil, the city looking almost new, almost hopeful. James glanced at Lily. Her shoulder brushed lightly against his arm. Neither moved away. In that quiet moment high above a sleeping city, 2 people who had once been trapped in their own forms of silence stood together. One had learned the courage to speak. The other had learned the wisdom to listen. And in the space between them, something beautiful and lasting had begun to grow. Real power, James realized as he watched the snow fall, was never about controlling others. It was about having the strength to listen to those who had been silenced for far too long. And the greatest changes always started when someone finally dared to break the silence. And someone else chose to truly hear. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you truly. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.